Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the bee's knees by the big cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 7, Day 4. But first, let's do our daily punishment. I asked a Frenchman if he played video games. He said, oui. Your key terms for today are the Interstate Highway Act, dynamic conservatism, John Foster Dulles, brinkmanship, Geneva Summit, Seattle, Sputnik, the Paris Summit, Fidel Castro, the election of 1960, James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause, John Steinbeck, Arthur Miller, Jacques Chirac, Allen Ginsberg, Beatniks, the Suez Crisis, the Eisenhower Doctrine, John F. Kennedy, IBM's, Joseph McCarthy, the Second Red Scare, the Venona Files. We're going to go over the domestic reforms under Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Second Red Scare. We'll talk about that a little bit more because it bleeds into the 1950s. Dwight Eisenhower's foreign policy and his anti-communism, and the election of 1960 and its impact. So let's get started. Dynamic conservatism was the name of Eisenhower's domestic policy, like Truman's was the Fair Deal. What the dynamic conservatism was is it's going to be a balanced budget. It's going to be a moderate form of conservatism. It's not like extreme conservatism. They're not going to try to get rid of the New Deal. It's pretty moderate. In some areas, Eisenhower will actually expand upon government use, but it is supposed to be a little bit more moderate. It's not as liberal as Truman or FDR, but it's not ultra-conservatism. Eisenhower is going to balance the budget 3 times. He's going to transfer offshore drilling to states. He's going to encourage competition with the TVA for private corporation. His Secretary of early version of Health and Human Services is going to condemn the free distribution of the Salk vaccine for polio as socialized medicine. His Secretary of Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson, is going to try to decontrol farming by turning it back to the free market, but we still have the TVA and stuff. We will have a new law, the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act. This was meant to strengthen the Taft-Hartley Act. Eisenhower's a Republican, so he's anti-union. The biggest economic problem in the 1950s will be the low price of farms. Farmers are going to struggle. However, despite all this stuff, Eisenhower is pretty moderate/liberal. He's going to extend Social Security. He's going to increase minimum wage to $1. His big domestic law that Eisenhower passes is the Interstate Highway Act. This creates interstate highways all across America. It's going to really connect the country with the increase of the car consumer culture in the 1950s. It really connects the whole country. It's a huge law that really, really is beneficial to America for the interstates. One of the things also that we're going to have is the IBM, which we talked about last class. IBM is a computer company. It was created in 1911. It creates large computers, early version of artificial intelligence. It will work with the government. This is the Interstate Highway Act and the interstates that are going to be created. You really see America, the lifelines being connected. Railroads aren't really used as much anymore, so really we need interstates. These are some of the earliest versions of IBM. You can see how huge the computers are. Let's talk about the Second Red Scare and Eisenhower's role. Joseph McCarthy was still around in the 1950s. Eisenhower did not like him, but he was afraid to go against him at first. McCarthy, under Truman's presidency, said there were 205 card-carrying members. He later changed that to 112 and then 57. The Senate's going to start investigations with McCarthy being one of the main people. He's going to use fear tactics and threatening to call people communist, McCarthyism. In the 1990s, the Russian government will release some of their secret files. These are called the Venona Files. Some of the people McCarthy did accuse were actually communist. It doesn't make what was right what he did, because he did just make these wild accusations at people he didn't like. It created a witch hunt mentality, but some of it was true. This whole witch hunt mentality will flourish during the Cold War in the 1950s. People's careers were ruined Politicians were afraid because they were afraid to go against McCarthy because of opinion polls showed he had high approval. However, McCarthy will bite off more than he can chew in the mid 1950s when he goes against the U.S. Army. The Army is seen as like the quintessential Americanism. He accuses like George Marshall, a World War II veteran, of being a communist. There's going to be Army hearings. The hearings that were going on during this time made McCarthy look really, really bad. His alcoholism was kind of spiraling out of control during that time. It made McCarthy look kind of crazy, and people are going to turn against McCarthy. He's going to be censored by the Senate, and really he loses all political power. This is during the some of the hearings from McCarthy. There's Joseph McCarthy right there. Let's talk about the foreign policy of Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's going to make his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. The whole idea of Dulles' foreign policy and Eisenhower's foreign policy was we don't want to just contain communism, but we want to roll it back. We will do massive retaliation. We'll use nuclear bombs. Like really the big idea of Eisenhower's foreign policy is threatening to use nuclear bombs. It's the idea of brinkmanship, to go to the very border of the line and not willing to back down and hoping the enemy will back down first. It's kind of irresponsible, honestly. But really, even though this was Eisenhower's foreign policy, he doesn't follow through with it. His foreign policy is going to be pretty similar to Truman's in a lot of regards. He's not going to use nuclear bombs. The Warsaw Pact is going to be created to counter NATO during Eisenhower's presidency. In 1955, there was the Geneva Summit. The Geneva Summit was the first time Western nations and the Soviet Union met since World War II in the Potsdam Conference. Some of the goals of it were to bring the world together, to begin discussions on peace, disarmament, trade negotiations, barriers, diplomacy, nuclear warfare. A lot of these things won't happen, but it is important because it's the first time the countries meet. The Geneva Summit also is where they're going to divide Vietnam between communist and non-communist nations. During Eisenhower's presidency, Seattle will be created, which is going to be an alliance system of non-communist countries in Asia, similar to NATO. In 1955, Joseph Stalin will die. Nikita Khrushchev will become dictator of Russia. He's going to denounce Stalin. This is called de-Stalinization. He's going to point out all the horrible things Stalin did. This is going to turn a lot of leftists in America, make them question why they'd been supporting Stalin during this time. It looked like for a time that Khrushchev will be a more friendly version of communism, but when the Hungarians go on strike and want more freedom, Khrushchev is going to send in the tanks and crush the Hungarian uprising. America had been talking big about brinkmanship and massive retaliation. The Hungarians beg for American aid, but Eisenhower does not want a nuclear war, so he's not going to do anything. This is why the whole idea of massive retaliation, brinkmanship, not very true. During Eisenhower's presidency, he will send the CIA in to engineer coup d'etats in both Iran and Guatemala to install pro-American governments, dictators, even if they're not, democratically elected. We do the same thing in Congo during Eisenhower/Kennedy's presidency. One of the big idea of brinkmanship and massive retaliation also is that countries now have nuclear bombs. So we're going to, under Eisenhower, we're going to invest in nuclear bombs, and we're going to invest in airplanes to fly the nuclear bombs. So under Eisenhower, there will be a huge investment in building more nuclear bombs and more airplanes to fly them. We don't have ballistic missiles yet. Here's a cartoon satirizing the whole idea of the arms race. The arms race definitely heats up under Eisenhower, although it was going strong under Truman as well. Let's talk about Eisenhower's foreign policy in the Middle East. There's going to be a crisis in Egypt. Gamal Nasser was the president of Egypt. He was a dictator. He seized power. But he flirted with communism. He flirted with the Soviet Union, but he was not a communist. He was an Arab nationalist that hated America for supporting Israel. After World War II, Israel was created as a country. The United States will support Israel. They'll give them arms and weapon and recognition. A lot of Arab countries did not like Israel. They felt like their land was stolen from Palestine and the Arabs. There's going to be a series of wars in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s in which Arab countries attack Israel. We have in the 1940s, after Israel's made a country in 1948, we have the 1948 First Arab-Israel War, in which basically all the Middle East attacks Israel and they fight them back. In the 1950s, Gamal Nasser is trying to really get Arabs to unite against Israel. He is kind of anti-American because of America's support of Israel. Nasser is going to nationalize the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was built by the British and the French. It was owned by the British at this time. He's going to nationalize it and take it over. What's going to happen is the British and French and Israel are going to attack Egypt on 1956. America did not know about this, and even though America supports NATO and stuff, Eisenhower was furious that they attacked without his permission and that they were attacking a country for really no reason because the Suez Canal was in Egypt's land. So America will side with the United Nations and Russia. This is one of the only times they side together during the Cold War for a ceasefire. It is going to give strength to the United Nations. Eisenhower will create a foreign policy in the 1950s for the Middle East called the Eisenhower Doctrine. This empowers the president to extend economic and military aid to nations resisting communist influence. So basically, it's like the Truman Doctrine in the Middle East. We will send soldiers into Lebanon under Eisenhower Doctrine to keep it from communism in 1958. Here's the Suez Crisis, the Suez Canal. There were some foreign flare-ups in the 1950s, so let's talk about those, kiddos. In 1957, the Russians launched the first rocket in space. It was like projected. It was the first artificial Earth satellite. The Russians launched it. Showed that the Russians were beating America to the space race with their rocketry and stuff. This is going to begin really the space race between the United States and Russia. It's going to shake American confidence that the Russians were ahead of us in science and math. There's going to be a fear that Russia has more missiles than the United States, which was not true. This is going to cause America to pass the National Defensive Education Act, which you should know. This is going to increase emphasis on math and science. This is one of the reasons why math and science is so focused on in the United States. It's going to be one of the first educational acts passed in the 20th century. In 1960, at the end of Eisenhower's presidency, there was the Paris Summit. Hopes were high that the United States would increase and improve relationships with Russia. Both countries were firm on Berlin. There was a whole Berlin crisis. Remember, Berlin at this time did not have a wall, and a lot of the people from East Berlin were going to West Berlin. That way they were no longer in the communist part, which the communist part of Germany was trash, very low standard of living. But what's going to happen in the Paris summit is an American plane was shot down, a U-2 plane. It was taking pictures illegally in Russian airspace. The Russians are going to hold the American pilot and they're going to hold him hostage. They're going to show him on national TV. They're going to demand an apology from the United States from invading their airspace. Eventually, Eisenhower didn't want to do it, but he eventually does to get the American to come home. It makes America look really bad, and this kind of kills the summit. One of the last things that Eisenhower does is he did support Figueroa Batista, who was a Cuban dictator, who was pro-American government. He was a dictator, but he supported capitalism and American business. Fidel Castro is going to rise to power in Cuba. He was a communist leader. He believed in communism. He's going to have support by the Soviet Union. He's going to overthrow Batista in the late 50s, 1959. Over 1 million Cubans are going to leave Cuba and go to Florida mostly. And now Cuba, which is right next to Florida, is communist. This is going to be a huge problem for later on. Also, Eisenhower is going to send advisors into Vietnam. Like we talked about before, in the Vietnam after World War II was given back to France. The Viet Minh are going to eventually kick out the French in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The whole French army is surrounded, and they have to surrender to the Vietnamese. After this, in the Geneva Conference, Vietnam will be divided into two parts: North Vietnam, which is communist, and South Vietnam, which is non-communist. France is no longer able to help out Vietnam, so America is going to start sending advisors into Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese government to prevent them from becoming communist. We're not sending soldiers in yet. We're going to start giving more and more money to South Vietnam, and Eisenhower was really the first one to really get us involved in Vietnam. Here's Sputnik. Here's Fidel Castro when he was a rebel against Batista. Let's finish up, guys. In 1960, there's going to be an election. The Republicans will choose the vice president, Richard Nixon. The Democrats will choose John F. Kennedy over the much more experienced and more qualified Lyndon Johnson. John F. Kennedy was more attractive than Johnson. They will run against each other in the Democratic primary. Kennedy will win. He had a better strategy in the primaries. He was more popular. LBJ will be made the vice president under Kennedy to appeal to the South. Kennedy was going to be Catholic. He was Catholic, rich and young. It's going to be a very close election. Honestly, there was a lot of corruption in parts of the election. Kennedy's dad had ties to the mafia, and there was a lot of corruption, especially in states like Illinois, where honestly Kennedy probably stole the election. One of the reasons Kennedy won, however, was the TV debates in 1960. This is the first time there was a TV debate between the Republicans and the Democrats. People that listened to the debate said that Nixon won, he had better ideas, but people that watched the debate said Kennedy won. One of the reasons that is as they were preparing for the debates, both Kennedy and Nixon were asked if they wanted to put makeup on. Kennedy said, "No, I'm a real man. I don't want to put makeup on." Nixon, who was very insecure about his sexuality and stuff, very toxic masculinity, he's going to refuse to put makeup on also, because if Kennedy doesn't, he won't either. As soon as they went back to their dressing room, Kennedy put on as much makeup as possible, because when you have those lights and cameras, it makes you look really sweaty. So when they actually had the debate, Kennedy looked like a bronze god. He looked very nice with the makeup. It made him look very tanned and young. And Nixon, you just saw sweat going down his face. He looked pale. Then Bobby Kennedy said, "I'm going to win this for this. I'm going to beat this SOB." So then Bobby Kennedy went down to the boiler room and he turned on the heat as much as possible. So Nixon just started pouring down sweat on his face. Kind of corrupt, but very smart. This is the election of 1960, guys. You see, super close. Lastly, in the 1950s, we talked about how there was conformity during this time, conformity in culture. There is going to begin to be a counterculture in the 1950s, which will also lead us to the counterculture of the 1960s. There was one of the big countercultural films of the 1950s was Rebel Without a Cause. It's going to be led by a heartthrob actor named James Dean. Here's James Dean right here. He wore leather vest, leather jacket, cool, rocker, motorcyclist. In Rebel Without a Cause, it stars Jim Stark, who's James Dean. He moves to get a clean slate in a new town. While searching for some stability, he forms a bond with a disturbed classmate and falls for a local girl. However, the girl is the girlfriend of a neighborhood tough. When Buzz, who's the tough, confronts Jim and challenges him to a drag race, this is where the trouble begins. Dun, dun, dun. So it's kind of like a story about isolation, fighting back against the man. James Dean is kind of the countercultural guy. The other guy is very cut, clean football star. Let's talk about some more stuff from the 1950s. We have some writers during the 1950s who either have negative or more critical portrayals of America, so it's counterculture. John Steinbeck, who portrays American society. He does books like Of Mice and Men and other things. Arthur Miller, who's a playwright, he does The Crucible, which is an allegory for the Red Scare, which is about the Salem witch trials. He also does Death of a Salesman, which is about the consumerism of the 1950s. One of the things we're going to have in the 1950s is you have a new type of person who is a counterculture. He's called a beatnik. A beatnik is a person who participated in social movements in the 50s and early 60s. They stressed artistic self-awareness, rejection of the mores and convention of the 1950s. Usually they're pretty young, artistic, and they rejected the conservatism of the 1950s. There's going to be some famous poets of the 1950s who are beatniks, Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. A lot of times beatniks are pseudo-intellectuals. They focus on drug use, cartoonish actions to really like stress like some of the idiocracy of the 1950s. Here are some beatniks right here. More beatniks. Some of these are satire pictures from later on. All right, kiddos. And that's all I have for you for today. Until next time. Deuces. Deuces, yeah.